So I know you are all here simply because you are terribly interested in the concept of free market environmentalism, right? It has nothing to do with the sheets of paper or the folks sitting in the hallway tracking you and making this a mandatory experience, right? You're all here just out of native curiosity. Yeah, none of you are actually going along with that. So we're going to talk for the next, probably 40 or 45 minutes about a concept of how we think about environmentalism in a slightly different way. So part of the reason why this topic resonates, at least with me, has to do with the places I grew up and the things that I care deeply about, but also because we often fail at trying to save the environment. And often we fail for a whole host of reasons. And so for the next hour or so, we're going to walk through some of the problems, but also a different way of thinking about about the environment itself. So we get this title, Environmentalism is Religion, Unpacking the Congregation. And we're going to start with this question, okay? This is a typical question that often we get asked. So how would you define environmentalism? Anybody want to translate it into Spanish for me so they can help ask? How would you say environmentalist in Spanish? Louder.
Ambientalismo.
Okay. So what is that?
Maybe the study of the environment.
Maybe the study of the environment is one possibility. Anybody else have a different idea of what environmentalism is? Okay, taking care of the environment. It's often one of the things that comes up. Anybody else? The use of the environment, okay? How do we use the environment? Well, it is a little bit of a difficult question to answer. So what I want to do with you is a thought experiment for a second. So Guatemala has a tremendous set of natural resources in the form of rainforests and other things. What's the proper way for those to be used? What should happen to those rainforests in the north part of the country? Okay, it might be about resources and using it. Is that typically, when we think of environmentalism, what we mean? What do we mean? Like I said, you twitch and I point.
When we talk about environmentalism, we think more about protecting it.
It's about protecting rather than using?
Maybe like taking accountability for the questions.
Okay, maybe taking accountability for those things. I think those are good definitions. So let me tell you a little story about the picture that's on this slide. So this picture actually is from an area right by a cabin that my husband's family has owned for a long time. It's a national monument in southern Utah that we look out over at that cabin. And I look at that and think, that's incredibly beautiful, right? And I'd really like to figure out a way in which that can continue to exist across time. But the question is, how do we do that without disrupting everything else we might want to do as we develop and grow? So if all of the land that is not currently settled in Guatemala was put into a protected status, what would happen? What would happen if all the land that's not currently occupied was protected? Yeah.
I mean, we could not build more stuff.
Okay, you couldn't build more stuff. You wouldn't have access to resources. Tourism would be really affected by it, right? All these different things end up being impacted by what we choose to do to save places like this. And part of what we're going to talk about, as I said, was we're going to talk about some of those approaches. And I'm going to walk you through some environmental history. So this is another place I love. This is in the image out the backside of the family ranch that I grew up on in the northern part of the state, a place I similarly love. But in the United States in particular, and as goes so many things, lots of the way we think about these things gets exported. We ship our ideas out just like China ships products. the way we think about these things often is the predecessor. So we're going to start with this guy. Anybody know who John Muir is? He was an environmentalist. I'm not going to give him the conservationist title for a reason, but John Muir was a guy who went to California and toured places like this and like this, and was interested in how we would preserve them. But he had a very particular vision of what the right policy was. And John Muir looked at that and said, heavens, something must be done. And when Muir, this guy right here with the long beard and the frazzled hair, looked around, he started to write things like this. Okay, so this is a long block quote from Muir. And I'm going to break the rule of good presentations, and we're going to read most of this quote together. But you don't understand where environmentalism comes from if you don't understand this part of Muir. Because Muir fundamentally believed exactly this. And almost all of our modern approaches to the environment grow directly out of Muir's vision. It says, any fool can destroy trees. They cannot run away. And if they could, they would still be destroyed. Chased and hunted down as long as fun or a dollar could be got out of their bark, hides, branching horns, or magnificent bull backbones. Any fool can destroy trees. What does that mean? It's easy to destroy trees. They're just there, right? You can go in and you can destroy them, and they can't run away. And even if they could, people would still chase them. This is how Muir thinks about people and the environment. He goes on, he says, few that felled trees plant them, nor would planting avail much towards getting back anything like the noble primeval forests. It took more than 3,000 years to make some of the trees in these western woods, trees that are still standing in perfect strength and beauty, waving and singing in the mighty forests of the Sierra. So he's talking about a particular place in California. Through all the wonderful, eventful centuries, God has cared for these trees, saved them from drought, disease, avalanches, and 1,000 straining, leveling tempests and floods, but he cannot save them from fools. Only Uncle Sam can do that. Okay? Okay. Anybody know who Uncle Sam is? Who's Uncle Sam? It's a government, right? It's the American government who he's referencing. So notice what Muir has said. What's the sum up of Muir here? That we shouldn't cut trees, and that the only way to preserve or protect them is for the government to act. Think about most environmental discussions here in Guatemala. Who is it that steps in to try to protect the environment? Who? The people. In what way? Like some charities. Okay, is it just good groups of people that come together to preserve the trees? Or is it something else? Government. In what way? Okay, policy, regulations, attempts to identify what's allowed and not allowed. It's almost always government that is the designee. Okay? Think about even those international groups that come into places that try to do these sorts of things. What is it they require when they come in? Do they just come in and just buy the land to preserve the trees most of the time? Is that what happens? What actually happens? They just take it, but they usually use government to do it. And so the point of starting with Muir, and I'm going to guess there's probably a Guatemalan or Latin American equivalent of Muir, but you're going to have to go find them because I know Muir from my own experience. But it's that they identify that they see a problem in something they want, and they see government as a way to use force to get what they want, and they bring the two together. And for Muir, and for others like him, and for most of the modern environmental movement, the answer to environmental problems has been government. But what we're going to look at is how did he get there, and is there an alternative? Can we somehow do it differently? Because Muir's approach is essentially a religious one. Muir has a vision of what the world is supposed to be like, and if you deviate from that vision, almost anything is justified in response. And for most environmentalists that would describe themselves, they have the same idea, that because they're correct, there simply should be a rule that can be enforced to achieve that outcome. But here's Muir. We have Muir again there on the far side. Normally, this one's a fun one with American college students, because they should all know who the other guy is, and they usually don't. Anybody know who this guy here is on your left? Yeah, who is he? President Teddy Roosevelt. That was way quicker than most of my American classrooms get him. Okay, who's Teddy Roosevelt? You recognized him. Why do you know who he is? He's a very famous American president. He was also someone who was interested in these lands. But I show you him because of what Muir did. Because Muir was trying to figure out how to get the Yosemite Valley protected, and he became convinced that if he could just get President Roosevelt to come out and see the valley, the president would use the stroke of his pen, the power of government, to preserve it, protect it, and not allow it to change. So he invites President Roosevelt out to the Yosemite Valley. Teddy comes out, looks at it, and does exactly what Muir hopes he will do. Uses straight force, the power of his pen to preserve it. And Muir accomplishes his vision through politics rather than through any other means. And starting with this, most of modern environmental action, most of what environmentalists do, has been attempts to get similar outcomes. To say, we see where the power exists to get what we want, and we're going to try to convince them to use it to achieve our goal. Anybody see any problems with that? What's that? Louder. Private land, okay. There was some private land in the Yosemite Valley that gets landlocked. There also were some inhabitants in the Yosemite Valley. Native Americans had been farming, hunting, and using the valley for generations. And suddenly, they're not allowed to do that anymore. Things like that ever happen in places like Guatemala? Yeah? Start looking very deep and you see the same thing. And as a result, that raw, unfiltered power becomes the norm. And because they believe so strongly in the rightness of what they desire, they view that power, that use of power, as legitimate. It's nearly religious, right? That's why this talk is titled Environmentalism is Religion. But the start of all this is back to a basic concept that I'm going to guess most of you have at least heard of, called public choice economics. How many of you have heard that term before? Yeah, I know Martin has. Martin spent a semester being yelled at by me up in Great Barrington. Nice to see you, although you were late. What do we start on time and end on time at AIER? Yeah. He's nodding along. Nobody else has heard of public choice? Adriana has. I see some nodding. What is public choice?
The politicians seeks their own interest and not the people.
That people have interests, they take action to achieve it, whether they're in the market, in politics, or really anywhere, and that the rules of the game often determine what they can accomplish. John Muir was doing public choice practically, even though nobody had ever come up with the term yet. And the result is, this is the pattern. Over and over again, we turn to government to try to answer those questions. Now, I've walked you through a fair bit of environmental history, and we could go on and on and on. But where we're going to turn now is there another way? Is there another way in which we might attempt to accomplish these same things? Or is it simply that Muir was right? Only Uncle Sam, only the government can solve the environmental problems. What do you guys think? Think there's another way? Can you imagine another way? Or is it just government? Okay, so civil society might be able to do it. Anybody else? Do we just all agree Muir is right? The answer is, if we're going to protect the environment, if those places that I loved and you probably love as well, you can think of your own, if they're going to be protected, the only hope is government. Okay, maybe a nonprofit can step in that's powerful enough.
Even take time that getting into society, but that I don't want to waste nature. So I mean, even changing the way we behave in nature and taking care of it without any of that.
Okay, so it might be possible for behavior to change without the coercive force of government behind it. It's possible. So let's talk about what I think are some approaches. Okay? Because if we stay stuck in sort of Muir's perspective, we'll continue to see the same sorts of outcomes. When I ask questions, especially among American college students, most of them report that they don't think the status of the environment is very good. How many of you think the status of the environment in Guatemala is good? Anybody want to raise their hand and say they think it's great? You think it's pretty good? Okay, could be worse.
I think that the people don't care too much about the environment and they don't protect it.
Okay, people don't care too much, they don't protect it.
I mean, following that thought, like right now it's not that bad, but because we don't care that much about the environment as a country, it's pointing towards getting worse in the future.
Okay, it might be trending worse. What's really sort of the most sort of revelatory is most people didn't just like nod that they thought it was great. Most of you are too shy or whatever to actually want to respond. But in general, we look at it and we say, we think it could be better, except for this guy who's like, it could be worse. But in general, most people aren't satisfied with the sort of outcomes we currently have. Okay? And as a result, if we continue to apply the same policy approach, that same approach that Muir used, where regulation is the primary response. So in Guatemala, there's a major problem with trash dumping, right? Is there a rule against trash dumping in Guatemala? Yeah. How well does the rule work? How well does it work? Why not? Somebody said not very. Why do you say not very? There's no follow-up. Is there a good alternative way to dump trash? No, right? So there's a rule that says you're going to do X, but it doesn't seem to work. Are there other things like trash dumping? The emissions? Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's supposed to be an emissions rule. All of this is Muir's approach. We set a rule from government and it should get solved, right, if it's going to hold. And if it's not working, what should we do? Punish and make the rule stronger. So what happens when they crack down on dumping in Guatemala? How long does that work? Not for long, right? Turns out it's very difficult because there's no real alternative. And so we're gonna talk about, as I said, 4 different types of approaches to environmental thinking that give us some different possibilities. The first approach is the one we've been talking about. It's that Muirian approach. It's this idea that there is a right and there is a wrong, and there must be a single rule that is enforced to get there. This quasi-religious notion that there is something that is just correct and we should follow it. I'm going to call that public law, the law made by government primarily, law that is imposed and regulatory. There's a second type, which I'm going to call private law. This is law where if you harm me, I can require you to pay for the harm that's done. So if you harm the community by dumping, the community can hold you accountable monetarily. We're going to call that the private law. In the United States, we would call that the law of torts. It's a very specific type of law that exists in the States. And it's really about being able to go to the courts and say, I was harmed and I should be compensated for the harm. Okay, so that's the second type. The third approach is civil society. The idea that we all live together and that there will be pressures exerted that could convince us to change our behavior. Okay? Think about your own behavior. Some of your parents, at least in the term in the US would be peer pressure. I'm going to guess some of you got lectures from your parents that you shouldn't just do what your friends do, that you should think for yourself, right? That's the negative side of it, right? The positive side is what we call civil society. It's the idea that we all have to live together, and that pressure that comes from living together leads us to behave in ways that are pro-social, to make it easier to live together. And that approach comes about in the everyday interactions that we have. So for example, an example of this in the United States was in the 1970s, the US had a huge litter problem where people were throwing things out of cars along the highways and the roadways. And it was pretty normal, wasn't looked down on. But there started to develop pushback, not necessarily regulations in the beginning, but it started to be looked down on, that you were becoming antisocial. You were deviating from the norm if you did this. And as a result, we started to see lots of pushes to don't, quote, one of the examples was, don't mess with Texas. How many of you ever heard that term? Okay. Everybody now thinks that's a term that's about Texas being strong, right? No. Turns out that comes from an anti-littering campaign from some nonprofits in the 1970s trying to convince Texans that you shouldn't leave a mess in Texas. It's held for that long. And that sort of thing changes the behavior. And the last one we're going to talk about is one that is near and dear to both UFM and my own heart, and that's the mechanism of exchange. How can the market serve to protect the environment and to change our behaviors? These are all approaches that we can take. And so we're going to start with the public law. These are things like laws, rules, ordinances, regulations that are put on the books that say you will do this or you can't do that. There's a problem with this, right? We could list a whole bunch of those problems. And mostly, they attempt to imagine every possibility that people might do that would create a harm and say beforehand, you can't do that. How many of you were pretty good at identifying the literal rules your parents had for you and then trying to come up with a loophole around it? Anybody had success at this? Some of you are still having success at this, I'm sure. Adriana's raising her hand over there. The problem, right, is, so any parents in the room? Probably one in the back. Your kids ever managed to come up with new and interesting ways to do things that if you could have known, you would have had a rule against? Yeah. Happens all the time. And the same is true of the regulatory approach. It's imperfect. It often doesn't work. And it often creates huge costs as we attempt to prevent every possible risk. We eliminate everything that can be done. Because Muir says, preserve every bit of the Yosemite Valley. The trees are so very important. But there might be things that could be done consistent. The second approach, as I said, was the private law. And here we address the consequences of the action, right? If you have to pay for the damage you did, what are you likely to think about the next time? What the cost will be if you take the action. What's the problem with this? Why might this not work?
There are people that don't care about the same amount of money.
Okay, so we all have different, economists would call it resource endowments. And so a cost to one person that's preventative won't be the same cost to another person. So identifying that is difficult. But it also only happens after the damage is done, right? Private law only prevents the next thing from happening. It doesn't prevent the initial problem. It says, you broke it, you have to pay for it. It can be very effective. And in the United States in particular, the tort system prevents all sorts of actions from happening the second time. Doesn't do it the first time. But it's a powerful tool. The third option is civil society. Those social pressures, the norms that we develop. Turns out there are lots of norms everywhere. Does UFM have any norms? Any ways you're expected to act or not act as a UFM student? What are some of those norms? No plagiarism. Okay? That's both a norm and a regulation. Okay, I've taught at UFM a couple of times. You could ask some of the students from my class last semester about Ryan's interpretation of that regulation. You'll find out I take it pretty literally. But what other norms exist here? Is it just don't cheat, don't steal? Are those just the norms of a UFM student? Or is there something more? Martin, what are the norms at UFM? Okay, to be on time to classes. Okay, some certain average. What kind of norms do you see? You're just nodding along? There are other norms you can come up with? Not right now? Pause. What's that? Paying on time. There's an expectation that you will put in for your own education, right? When you choose to come to UFM, there's that expectation. It's a norm that's developed. Is there a norm about how students treat each other at UFM? Yeah, what is that norm? So I see a norm in action almost every time I come. What's the norm about how people treat each other on campus? Okay, there's a respect norm. Those things all drive this identity, and we all live within norms. They're imposed on us by the social groupings we exist in. Think of your friend groups. Are there norms inside your groups of friends? Are there ways you're expected to act within some of your friend groups? Anybody come up with a norm in their friend group? All right, so I was sitting out on the patio on the 4th floor having lunch today, and one of the things I always am amused by is watching the students interact on that patio. And there are norms at play every time. There were expectations about how people were going to interact, and you could watch those interactions happen in real time. Okay? If you deviate from what's expected, what happens? What happens? You get isolated, right? And it turns out it drives our behavior. The same can be true in the environment. And we use a process called suasion, where we're convincing you that you should behave in a certain way to be part of the broader group. Because your friends don't normally, except for the set of about 6 guys I saw today where one put another one in a headlock, we don't normally use violence in our friend groups to get people to obey the norms. We're convincing people every day. That's the process of civil society, is we're all interacting because we want to remain part of the group. And if we don't, as she said, we become isolated. And those norms can drive our behavior in really interesting ways. The most interesting one, I think, is this last one, the idea of exchange. The formal and informal relationships by which we trade with one another. Okay? Why do we trade? Why do we trade with one another? Yeah. Okay, benefit, that's at the root of it all. But why trade? Why don't I just steal from you? Is it just because I'll be punished by the law? It's the ideal strategy. I should just steal from all of you while you're here in this room? Why not? Yeah, sure. Why shouldn't I just steal from you? Why is trade better? Because I only get to steal from you once, most likely, right? The next time I show up, what happens? You're probably going to use force to prevent me from stealing from you again. But in trade, what happens if we both benefit the next time I come around? We're going to do it again and again and again, and because we both benefit, we want to continue on with it. Now, we've walked through a pretty heavy theoretical set of ideas, right? And some of you are sitting there going, why did we just get a lecture on these different economic concepts? I thought I was here to talk about environmentalism. But let's pull back, because normally we think about just the first thing with environmentalism, right? We say there's a problem and we're going to make a rule. And I want to talk about some of the alternatives, using some examples. So we're going to step in to a set of environmental groups that I know relatively well. And we're going to divide those categories up into regulation and suasion, okay, where we're trying to convince others. And environmental groups typically do one of these two things, okay? They either lobby for regulation or they try to convince people to behave differently. So let's talk about that got tiny all of a sudden. Let's talk about the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. That was one of the places trying to preserve the very first picture I put up. So you imagine you're trying to preserve what we call a wilderness, a place that's not been developed yet. How would you go about it? What are some ways you might preserve that? Okay, you could go to the government and say, we're going to declare this a wilderness and we're going to make a rule that says you can't develop it. Okay, so that's one. one way. What are other ways? Okay, think about our 4 types. The 4 things we talked about. What's another way of preserving?
I like the way of like the exchange, how we can offer something to preserve this. Like, yeah, I don't know what exactly you could offer, but like, yeah, an exchange.
Okay, so I could buy it, and when I own it, I can say no development. Okay, that would be another approach, right? Standard trade-based approach. What about the other 2? What might civil society do?
Agree to not touch the protected place.
Okay, we might have the don't mess with Texas approach and try to educate people about how to use it. So in the US, there was a major push called the Leave No Trace movement for camping and backpacking. It was an attempt to use social pressure to get people to camp and hike in ways that didn't disturb the land. Okay? Worked fairly well. Most serious backpackers and campers bought into that notion. And in places like Yosemite and in places like Zion National Park, the backcountry got measurably better off when those campaigns started to happen. Okay? What about the third one? What about private law? How might a private law solution where we hold you responsible for your actions monetarily work? Well, we can make you, if you damage the land, pay for the cost of bringing it back to what it was before. Notice the difference, right? There's no necessarily right answer between the options. But look at how broad the options actually are if we stop thinking about things as it just being one possibility and we start to think about there being lots of potential ways to achieve the goal. Now, the problem, of course, is this group, the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, isn't just looking and saying, what are the plethora of ways? Instead, they have a very specific goal. They're going to defend the Red Rock Wilderness from oil and gas development, unnecessary road discretion, rapid off-road vehicle use, and other threats. And they use a very specific set of tactics. So I want you to look at this little thing here. I made a set of undergraduates one summer code every action done by this group over about a 10-year period and code it into those 4 different categories. Turns out, about 90% of what they do was an attempt to use the public law to set rules rather than the other kinds. Where they could convince Congress or the courts to just make a rule, they thought they could win. But it left so much on the table. So many possibilities that were possible. Same, another group, Wild Earth Guardians, we see a similar pattern. They have a very clear one. They're just going to litigate for the wild. That's their literal mission statement. Never seen anything more honest than this because that's what they do. They just file suit over and over and over again in order to try to implement the public law. Either of these groups succeeded? What do you think? Is the wilderness better today, and is there more of it than there was when they started? No, it turns out there's not. Turns out they've continued to push, and there's more use than ever of the land. And so instead, we turn to what I call voluntary environmentalism. Because these other things are involuntary. They're going to make us all be environmentalists whether we want to or not. We're all going to become activists because we're going to set the rules in such a way. And instead, we could do these things voluntarily. And it turns out there's a lot of this already happening. The entrepreneurship that exists in the environmental space is huge. Anybody recognize this quote? The alertness to unnoticed opportunities. Anybody tell me who said that? Martin, who said that? He doesn't remember his lectures from AIER. Okay. You have some spaces on campus named after him. This is Israel Kirzner. Defined entrepreneurship as this alertness. And it turns out that alertness lets people scan and find opportunities outside of just the regulation. And one of those guys was a guy named Hank Fisher. Anybody recognize what this animal is? It's a wolf. Hank Fisher worked for a group that was pushing to reintroduce the wolf to Yellowstone National Park. And there was lots of controversy about it. Who would be opposed to reintroducing the wolf into Yellowstone, into this national park in the middle of Wyoming in the US? Who might not like it? Am I out of time? Okay, they might not know the consequences. Well, what do wolves do? They hunt, right? Okay, so there's no longer wolves there.
So you're afraid you might get that out?
Okay, it might be extended that way. So why were lots of jaguars killed in Central America and other big cats? What's that? For their fur, number one. What was the second reason? Who did they harm? Cows and other domestic livestock, right? And that's exactly who opposed the wolf reintroduction. It was farmers and ranchers who were running cows and sheep next to Yellowstone National Park, who would be negatively impacted if we simply reintroduced the wolf and said, this is the rule. So Hank Fisher, character of a guy, decides he has a crazy scheme. He's going to go out and talk to the ranchers and say that his group will pay them for every animal killed by a wolf where they can show them the carcass and they can see that a wolf did it. Notice what happens there. What changes as soon as Hank makes that offer? Do the farmers love that their animals get killed? No, but what changed? Yeah. They're no longer losing money, and as a result, they're less resistant. And so Hank and a group called Defenders of Wildlife create this program, and it runs for nearly 20 years very successfully. It reduces the opposition, and the wolves are returned to Yellowstone and the area. Goes on for a long time, okay? From the 1980s to the 2010s, when the program ends. Anybody want to take a guess as to why the program ended? No, there are more wolves in Yellowstone today than there were ever before. Why might a program like this end? Well, it could be they ran out of money, right? They could have run out of money, so they couldn't pay anymore. Turns out that's not the reason either. The program ends because it goes from being exchanged between a private group and the ranchers to it becoming a program of the U.S. Bureau of Land Management. And the dynamics change. It's no longer an exchange. You're no longer choosing to be part of the program or not. It's just there as a regulation. And the program dies in 2010. Goes away, there is no credibility. But it worked beautifully for those 30 years. Not everyone loved the wolves, but they stayed there. So, this is part of the Western United States, and there's a question about mining. I think you all may have some questions about mining in Guatemala as well that would disrupt. So what do we do? So there's a desire to mine, and there is an environmental question. What are our options if we're concerned about the effect mining could have? What are our options? Okay, we could do private law, right? If someone is legitimately harmed, they can sue and they can be reimbursed for their cost. We can make the person causing the damage internalize it and pay. Very typical approach, often works very well. Okay, what's another approach? Exchange, right? Could simply be that they purchase the land directly and they internalize the full cost because they bought the land for its full value. Okay, others? What are other options? Maybe we're not willing to have it just be strip mines. What are the other options? Okay, how would civil society do it? Louder? Okay, yep, you're giving me all the things I said to you. Now let's apply them. What sort of norms might work here? Somebody had their hand up. Yeah. Through a movement that says, we don't want you to mine here. And pressure starts to develop. Well, there's another option, right? What's the other option? We could just ban it, right? We could say, not going to let you mine at all. All of those different options can be on the table, but we almost always end up at the last one. That if we're concerned about the effect mining will have, we don't think about the other three options and simply say, no mining. And instead, there are ways to think about these things that don't just leave us where government is our only option. It doesn't have to be a yes or no religious style question. It's not just do this or don't do it. There are lots of possibilities. And that's really at the end of this whole conversation I want you to think about. Because it turns out this was a mine where you had civil society, a little bit of regulation, and a whole bunch of private law where they could be held accountable if this drifted downstream, ended up with land that looked like that at the end of the process.